Hi, I'm Dan Ashley, the evening news anchor for ABC 7 News in San Francisco, and I hope you and your loved ones are staying safe, healthy, and comfortable during these very challenging times. I am also a proud board member of the Commonwealth Club, one of our most important Bay Area institutions. The club has been hosting wonderful events with exciting speakers and topics in the Bay Area for over a century. In times of crisis, good information and strong connections in our community are especially important. And during the current COVID-19 crisis, the club has really stepped up. Since March 6th, the club has brought you over 150 live-streamed events with speakers and panelists, including past governors, secretaries of state, and many, many more. Every program includes a live chat, so you and viewers all over the Bay Area and beyond have been able to ask these experts the questions that are on your minds. Every program has been neutral and unbiased in true Commonwealth Club style to get to the bottom of the issues that are so drastically affecting our lives. The club has done all this public service despite being profoundly affected by the crisis. The inability to hold events for the past 2 months has forced the club to cut its budget and staffing by 50%. The remaining staff are working from home to bring the community these valuable and informative live-streamed programs. The club needs your support to continue its shelter-at-home programming. Please make a tax-deductible donation to the club now by texting the word DONATE to 329-4231. That is, donate to 329-4231, or visit the Commonwealth Club website, commonwealthclub.org. We need the club to be here in the months and years ahead to help inform and educate as we figure out how to get our society and our economy safely moving again, consider changes to the way we live, and work as a result of this crisis, and take steps to prevent a future pandemic. Once again, please support the Commonwealth Club now by texting the word donate to 329-4231. That is, donate to 329-4231, or visit the website commonwealthclub.org. I want to personally thank you for supporting one of our community's truly great organizations. I'll see you on ABC 7 News and at the Commonwealth Club. Stay safe.
Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to this virtual Commonwealth Club program. My name is Tim Wu. I'm a professor at Columbia Law School, and I am your moderator for today. And I'll just start with a reminder. During our program, we will have time for your questions, so please submit them in the chat box, and we'll do our best to get to them. Now, it is my pleasure to introduce today's special guest, Zephyr Teachout, who is the author of Break 'em Up, Recovering Our Freedom from Big Ag, Big Tech, and Big Money. Zephyr and I have known each other for a long time. In fact, I was her running mate back in the 2014 gubernatorial primary. And she is an attorney, a political activist, an antitrust and corruption expert. And she has been fighting the good fight for many years now. She sits on the board of directors of the Open Market Institute, teaches law at Fordham University. And so please join me in welcoming Zephyr Teachout. I'll do the clapping. Zephyr, we're here to talk, at least initially, about your book. And one of the things that I found so striking, so moving, was the depiction of the chicken farmers. So, it seems like something people don't think about that often. But what does your book have to say about the career of a chicken farmer?
Well, first of all, thank you all for coming, and thank you, Tim, for doing this, and thank you to the Commonwealth Club. Tim and I and others have been part of this growing anti-monopoly movement around the country, and I think it's really important, which is why I write about this in the book, to really give a face and an understanding of what the human impacts of this sort of gross growth of political power in the private sector, what those human impacts are. So I lead off the book with telling stories, and I talk to a lot of chicken farmers about the experience of chicken farmers and the monopolists that they deal with every day, which are the big distributors, Tyson, Perdue, Pilgrim. And the reason I use chicken farmers is in part because we see farmers as sort of the quintessential independent businessman or woman. You take out your own loan for your own chicken house. You make your own decisions. But when you actually look at what happens when you are trying to get chickens to market in most markets, except for this tiny little fraction that is direct to consumer, the CSAs, is that basically these chicken farmers cannot survive without going through one of these big monopolists. So let's take Tyson, for instance. Tyson then will say to a chicken farmer, great, we'll take your chicken to market, but you have to use our feed. And by the way, you have to use our design specs for your chicken house. And you have to use our lighting systems. And you have to use our medicines, and you have to use our eggs, and you have to use our consultants, and you have to use our energy sources. And a failure to use any one of these basically means the chicken farmer can't get her chickens to market and goes bankrupt and is on the hook for this $1 million farmhouse. So there's this extraordinary level of control for somebody who looks independent. But it's not just that. They also sign a contract, which we may talk about later, to arbitrate any disputes. So if there ends up being a dispute, You'll never be in front of a judge who is paid for by the public. You'll be in front of a judge who's paid for by Tyson in a secret court without the rules of evidence applying. And then you also sign a contract that you can't talk to your neighbors. You can't talk to other chicken farmers. And you are going to get paid different amounts every month depending on how much you produce. So you're actually in this state of something that looks like freedom from a distance, but is actually the opposite. It's a state of incredible rational paranoia. So if you have a bad month and get your chickens aren't doing very well, is it because the weather was bad? Is it because Tyson was doing an experiment on you? And Tyson is sitting in this choke point role. They can say, hey, let's give 200 farmers this feed and 400 farmers this feed and see how it plays out. They have incredible insight into what is happening in these chicken houses, but the insight doesn't go back the other way or between farmers. So instead, you are truly a subject of this experimental governmental regime. And one of the human effects that I don't think we talk enough about is that it leads to an incredible amount of humiliation and depression. The chicken farmer that I talked to who served as a guide throughout this chapter talked about not only the percentages of farmer suicides, which you may have seen, it's been widely reported that farmers have an incredibly high rate of suicide, but talking people down from suicide and the depression and the extreme, almost debilitating anger that farmers feel because of their position of impotence. And so I think it's important to tell that story. Oh, and by the way, and John Oliver has did a great show on this. There's been other reporting on this. There's very real evidence that chicken farmers who spoke up against this system during a series of hearings that was held by the Obama administration were retaliated against. So the system actually literally cuts out the tongues of the chicken farmers and makes them politically fearful to talk about the thing that they know the most about. Right. So this is their governing regime. And the argument of the book is that we are all getting chickenized, that this chicken farmer regime is not just in chicken houses, that the Amazon seller has the same relationship to Amazon Marketplace. The Uber driver has the same relationship to Uber. And in industry after industry, you see news sources have the same relationship to Facebook. You see this humiliating relationship of rational paranoia. And it's bad for wages, but it's also bad for our psychic condition.
Yeah. When I talked to you when you're writing this book, I remember you saying at one point that you ended up writing a lot more about suicide than you expected. And one thing I really appreciate this book and why I urge our audience to get a hold of it is it does something which is very challenging, which is to put a human face on economic power. Everyone's familiar with what political power looks like. If you get arrested, thrown in prison for your beliefs, but economic power, kind you're describing, is more insidious. Do you have any other industries or other examples you might highlight, or where what made you say that just writing about some very depressing conditions for people?
Well, one thing I've been thinking about a lot that I mention in passing is what is happening to the restaurant industries around the country, and it's become much more severe because of the pandemic and because of restaurants' incredible reliance on delivery apps. But when you look at once you see the basic business model of chickenization, you look at who is moving into that area and who is going to be the chicken farmer, basically, in the next scenario. And there's been a lot of good reporting on how badly the drivers are treated. But the real story about who's the chicken farmer in this situation is the restaurants. So if you have Seamless, Uber playing this platform role, the first step is to get to be one of the 2 or 3 choke points. And you can think of it's some kind of oligarchic power. I think it's actually similar to the mafia in some ways. You have multiples. It's not just one often, it's a couple, but it's not so many that you have meaningful choices. So you want to get in this choke point position. And then once they're in that position, they start by extracting high fees. Basically, if you rely on delivery to stay alive, you need to be on Seamless. And if you're not, it's a death sentence. But then the next steps are the same thing that Amazon and other choke points provide, which is insight into these businesses. How are you operating? Well, I want to gather, basically suck up as much data as possible about these different companies, maybe compete against them. And thinking about the precarious situation that restaurants are in because of the pandemic, and then also because of these platforms. And the reason I think it's important to think about that is not only does it lead to incredible depression and anxiety, but I think anybody, rural or urban, can see the ways in which restaurants and having diversity of restaurants and having not sort of a monolith of restaurants, not just because they're chains, but because they're controlled by Seamless and Uber, is actually really important for community. And so there's so many values that are lost when we allow for this concentration. It leads to conformity, precarity, fear. And one goal I make the explicit comparison between chicken farming and Uber drivers is to show that a lot of the divides that we think we have between rural and urban just aren't there. There are people who are experiencing very, very similar relationships to these forms of power. And then the final point I'd make is that we do actually have a lot of language in politics for talking about this. And to your point, it's one of my goals here is to take back economic talk from the economists. They've stripped away a lot of the rich language to describe how we live, and people feel often really intimidated. They're like, okay, I'm a progressive, so I feel really strongly about tax policy, but they don't feel like, oh, well, I'm not an economist, so I can't say anything about tax policy. They say, I feel strongly about labor policy. They don't then say, well, I'm not an economist, so I can't say anything about what the minimum wage should be. But there is something really, really dangerous and powerful about the way professional economists have said, no, when it comes to market structure, get out. You have no business here. If you don't know how to define what a market is, don't talk. And we have the language for describing economic success. And your intuitive understanding of your world doesn't belong here. And I want to sort of re-invite people's human experiences and say that, yeah, fear is part of of describing economic structures. Joy is part of describing economic structures as well.
Now, Zephyr, can I get a little more into this question of chickenification? Is that your coinage? What you're talking about, if we got this right, is a little different than what people have in mind when they think of the traditional monopoly like Standard Oil or Alcoa, let's say, not everyone, but this one producer who sells everything. Now, what you're talking about, if I'm getting this right, is really middleman monopolies, middleman power. Is this right? Where you have a lot of producers, like a lot of small chicken farmers, or maybe on the Amazon marketplace, a lot of little sellers. And they're the producers, and then you have the buyers way on the other side of it. And then in the middle, the power is where the power's gotten concentrated. So that the middle, the person in the middle, or the corporation middle, that's what we're talking about. I just want to make sure if that's how you see it. And if that's right, is that something you see that has really more recent? Obviously, is going to predate tech, but is there a pioneer? Is this a Walmart who thought of this first? I'm just curious if you think this just came all of a sudden, or has been a gradual process.
No, I do think it's a gradual process, and it's certainly not entirely new to the last 50 years. But one of the things you see is the ways in which Amazon has learned from Walmart, for instance. There's very close study, and somebody we both know, Barry Lynn, wrote several years ago about the way in which Walmart controlled the sweetener used by Coca-Cola, and could do so because access to shelf space was so critical, and sort of a similar kind of model of using access as a way to peer into suppliers and control suppliers. I think there's been a lot of innovations in this form of control and power in the last few years, and certainly big data really just amps it up extraordinarily, because it's one thing to require a certain degree of reporting from Coca-Cola about a few ingredients. That's, some degree of insight into the company that Walmart had. But the kind of insight that if you take, say, another ag monopolist, John Deere, that the tractor company, which is effectively a duopoly market, the tractor companies, the kind of insight they can have into those farmers, like what the weather systems are like, the kind of data they can collect about what is being planted, is so much greater, that it's both an increasingly attractive business model, and why so many people are rushing for that middleman role, and so much of capital is flowing to that middleman role, because the reason capital flows to it is because you can make a lot of money once you have a choke point, and can differentiate between different suppliers to basically squeeze each just to their breaking point, but not to break. And before, I think you had to be a lot more general about that. As you have written about, and I also write about in this book, the major innovation is the legal innovation, and the changing ways of thinking about this. And so much of the changing way of thinking about this is to say, let's really focus on the consumer and not look back at the suppliers. But another part of this insight that companies have that I talk about, and it's a dark prediction that I want to make a dark prediction about, is that there's two categories that are especially harmed by these choke points: the suppliers of goods, but also workers, people who work directly for these companies. In the case of Amazon, this is warehouse workers. And one of the things that we are seeing a pretty rapid adoption of is workplace surveillance. And that workplace surveillance necessarily has a political valence. Citizens United allowed corporations to spend unlimited money in campaigns so long as they aren't coordinating with the candidate. But it also basically freed up these same corporations to not be worried at all about political spying or pushing political messages to their own workers. And workers are, again, rationally paranoid. There's some recent evidence that a decent percentage of workers, over 10% of workers, actually fear political retaliation for their political beliefs. That should be really worrying. And the more you increase surveillance, not just to workers, but the dark vision is to the workers of those suppliers, that sort of surveillance can jump deep down the supply chain. That has really profound political effects, because when you have a concentrated system plus surveillance, plus rational paranoia and fear, and especially now with so few jobs and with genuine precarity, people feeling so uncertain, it actually leads to a lot of people just shutting up about politics in different ways. And Montesquieu, who was the fountainhead, the most important thinker that the framers of our own Constitution relied on, said that when you see signs of fear in interesting places, fear is a sign of tyranny. So, like, be alert to places where people are, strange places where people are scared. And when I started to sell this book, before I'd written it, I was sitting across the table from a potential agent who really liked this idea of chickenization and said, just don't make it about Amazon. And he didn't have any direct evidence that Amazon would suppress the book. This is how fear works, is just a sort of preemptive, cautious approach to say, well, I know they control the book industry, so let's just find a different example, put it later in the book. And if that's a conversation I'm having, and you and I have been very outspoken about our views, think of all the little driblets of fear that are suppressing a vibrant political life for people who are in much more precarious situations.
No, understood. It highlights something that I think is interesting and important about your book, is this idea you have of private government, the importance of understanding what's going on as governance. Can you say a little more about that idea? In fact, I think you equate monopoly with tyranny at some point, and
Yes.
put this all together for us. Yeah.
Yeah. So I actually come to this, to writing about this from a very different background than Tim. I started by writing about corruption and started by writing about public government and ways in which public government could be corrupted. And one of the things I realized is that in so many areas, we are functionalist in the way we describe things. That is to say, if it looks like a duck, it walks like a duck, we say, we're going to call it a duck. Everybody understands that it's a duck. But that there's a weird tendency when it comes to economic power to treat it as solely within a market sphere, and to treat people who are acting in a market sphere as if they are just seeking cash and not power. And I just think this is like a bad human nature analysis. Read Shakespeare. The idea that maybe there are a few people who are cash seeking only, but there's most of our big tycoons are quite happy with their powerful perch and their control over other people. And when it comes to tech, they've described this in different ways. Bezos has said, he's more private than others, but he says, I like to be depended on, which is either a nice thing to say or a little bit, makes one a little bit uncomfortable when you realize the degree of dependence is the kind of thing you can see a tyrant saying, I like to be depended on. Or Eric Schmidt, who said, just give me a city and we'll run it better. Or Mark Zuckerberg, who has said, really, we're more like a government. And actually, once you listen to these people talk, they're not actually hiding their governmental ambitions. Mm-hmm. There's a phrase that's used in the economic literature sometimes, looking at mergers, called the urge to merge. And there's evidence that CEOs are far more likely to seek out mergers than people who are just looking at these in terms of balance sheets. There's an Alexander the Great desire for power that we really have to just be honest about. These are power seekers, and when you look at Amazon in particular, he's done an amazing job of, if you think of it as a game of risk, like taking over territories and then trusting that eventually you'll be able to extract the resources from those territories. But the first game is to own the territory. So one reason I think it's important to think about it as governing is because of understanding human motivation. Another is that in functional terms, looks like a duck, walks like a duck, is a duck. They're doing a lot of things that governments do. Apple says, hey, to be on our app store, you pay 30%. That looks like a tax. When Tyson changes the feed hormone that they require producers to use, it's like the regulatory agency has spoken. And I think the example that may feel the most resonant to people is Zuckerberg, who quite clearly is our privacy czar right now. We treat him as our privacy czar. I hope we dethrone him. But the petitions to Zuckerberg are the petitions to a king who controls privacy. And when he makes changes in privacy, private regulation, that goes across the industry. It goes not just the industry, it goes across the entire society. So I think we should take a functional approach and say, just because we can vote doesn't mean that there aren't these other forms of government arising. And then in the more traditional anti-corruption stuff, there they're just all over the place when it comes to not all over the place in terms of scattered, all over the place in terms of everywhere when it comes to buying up both political power in the crude sense of lobbying or campaign finance contributions, but also buying up the way we think, spending money on think tanks. Sorry?
Right. Can I interrupt you? So I just want to tease out this distinction. I mean, one of the things you're saying that I think is important, subtle but important, is there is a difference between one kind of economically powerful actor. I don't know, let me traditionally say Ford Motors or something, or even Standard Oil in the old days, where they have a lot of money, a lot of economic power, and then they influence government to do things that they want. Now, you're saying that's going on, and that's a sort of traditional concern with corruption. But I think with some of these companies, and actually Tyson and the chicken farmers is a good example, or maybe Amazon's control over its suppliers, and even when you get into privacy in our lives, that they are governing us directly, not just influencing government, but also governing directly in ways that matter to us, how we communicate with people, what we can say. And I just want to make sure that clear that you're saying both of those things, right? Not just for they influence traditional government, but they also are governing. Yeah.
I am, and thank you for putting the pin on that, because I think it's really important. I think people get the second easier, like buying politicians and buying think tanks. But I'll give you one example that I've been thinking about writing about, actually, which is Amazon's intellectual property regime. So Amazon has these internal governance judicial systems. And the writer Josh Ziza from The Verge has done wonderful reporting on these governance systems, where if you get kicked off, you can appeal. There is a huge cottage industry of consultants that help navigate the internal judiciary of Amazon. And there have been two kinds of stories that go in seemingly opposite directions. Stories of Amazon summarily kicking off people without any process for being fakes, and stories of Amazon, despite repeated claims, not kicking off fakes. And in fact, there's some great congressional testimony from the CEO of a company called PopSockets, who describes his experience as finally getting the fakes kicked off, just direct ripoffs kicked off once he separately purchased Amazon advertising. So seeing that there's a relationship between purchasing one good and responsiveness in the other way. But what's interesting to me is that we could say Amazon is really strict about intellectual property, or we could say Amazon is really lax about it. I think the better way to say it is that they have their own judicial regime, but it's a self-serving judicial regime. And there may be some situations in which Amazon really benefits from a flood of fakes because it drives up the prices, and other situations where Amazon is hurt by the flood of fakes. But it's a private intellectual property regime that has some distant relationship to our public intellectual property regime. But as far as sellers are concerned, it matters far more than the public intellectual property regime is Amazon's own governmental systems.
I want to pick up and emphasize something else that you said. If I understand your book correctly, and I think this can almost get glossed over, even though it's so important, what you are concerned about is actually slightly different than what antitrust has come to be concerned about since about the 1980s. The concern that has been a concern since the 80s, driven by price theory, Chicago school influence, other things that I won't bore people with, is the problem of things becoming too expensive, right? So someone makes washing machines, they have a monopoly, and they sell them for $1,000 instead of $500. But you are concerned, and it's just evident throughout everything, about the effects on producers. So not just what it means to buy stuff in this country, but what it means to try and make stuff in this country. You're concerned about labor. what it means to work in this country. And I guess my question is, I mean, obviously you think it's right for antitrust to care about all this kind of things. Why don't you think antitrust, what has happened, maybe I'll ask it, that you don't get, it just seems natural you would care about what it means to work in this country, what it means to make things in this country. Why isn't it that antitrust is doing that?
Wow. Starting in about 1980, although there's a more gradual story, and it's so great to talk to you about it. And I do have to say, you should definitely buy my amazing book and read it and discuss it. But you should also read Tim's book and his incredible history and wonderful descriptions of how we got here. But how we can get out of it. So around 1980, Ronald Reagan came in with his California Wrecking Crew. And the California Wrecking Crew, think Mies, for instance, brought along an interesting collection of priorities. One priority was doing everything to roll back the gains of the civil rights movement. And another was deregulation. And at the heart of the deregulatory agenda was totally transforming antitrust. And I want to pause on this for a second, because I think sometimes people, even people who think they understand this and care about it, to realize that if the Reaganites believed that if they could change antitrust, they could change everything, and they were right. Like the centrality, they were wrong about they were wrong on the merits, but they were right about the centrality of antitrust when it came to the structure of our entire society. And actually, if you look at the flip side, who are the anti-Reaganites? Phil Hart, this incredible senator who had two big passions: civil rights, and he was a central architect of the Civil Rights Act of '65, and antitrust, because he also saw these as two key methods for stopping illegitimate power, two key ways of achieving freedom. And so I actually, the core values I start with are values of freedom and equality. Like, this is what we should be seeking in our society. So Reagan's Wrecking Crew comes in and they appoint judges, and they bring in enforcers who don't believe in enforcing, and they rewrite the antitrust guidelines to say what these laws are about, the existing laws are about, is not about all of these human democratic values. All of these laws are about making sure your toothpaste doesn't start doesn't cost too much. I care about consumer price, and people should care about consumer price. But there's something really weird, and it's bad history, bad law, to focus on consumer price as the only value that antitrust laws reflect. I sometimes think about it like, well, no, I'll
yeah, sure.
keep going with this. Yeah. So the real mystery then is, well, after Reagan, why didn't, yeah. And I write about this a little bit, but I think one area that we all have to really think about is the relationship between race and corporate power. I don't think it's an accident that the California Wrecking Crew, that was sort of seeking a more authoritarian society, brought these two agendas along together. It doesn't seem like an accident that Hart connected those two. I think we now tend to think about them as separate, but that they're deeply connected. And having said that, I don't think I've fully answered the mystery of whether it was a bargain on the part of the Reaganites, basically we can get corporate money to align with the civil rights backlash if we give them these favors, or vice versa, or if it's a coherent ideology, because I think those are two possible ways to understand the connection between the two.
Sure. Great. Actually, I want to apologize to our audience if I have any distortions. I'm actually on an Ethernet connection. so it's not Wi-Fi, but I have the local ISP monopoly. I'm out in the country, you have no choice, and they are just melting the ice cube, as they say, making no investments into making this DSL connection any better. Anyway, one thing I wanted to tease out a little more on this topic of private governance. It is not entirely unprecedented in this country, especially as compared to other countries, to have private industry occupy roles that would be traditionally occupied by government in other countries. For just a very trivial example, garbage collection in a lot of the United States is done privately, while most of the rest of the world is public. And health insurance, another big example. And even when it comes to employees, I think we're one of the few developed countries in the world which has the presumption that employers will provide the health insurance as opposed to government. So one model, if you think about the mid-century somewhere, there was a lot of private power. There was this idea that people in their lives were cradle to grave employees and taken care of. They had healthcare, maybe they even had housing. It's in a corporate town sometimes. So is it enough, or is it maybe your vision that if you accept the idea that we are being effectively governed by very powerful companies, that all we really want them to do is be better rulers? People are working in Amazon warehouses, pay them more, give them better benefits. If our next generation is destined to be doing that job, do we just want them to be more publicly spirited, or do you sort of reject that altogether as essentially anti-democratic? I'm just curious if it's just improvement or what you think is the answer.
Yeah, it's a great question, because I think the one thing that we should have a default presumption against is governing private power. And that doesn't mean that sometimes things can't be centralized, but when they are centralized, they should be basically treated like, if we want them to be centralized so badly because of some value, they should essentially be treated like a public utility, and have the non-discrimination principles, access principles apply. But you're right that in a few areas, not in retail like it is now, not in farming, in a few areas, there were companies that played a role that now feels just almost like a fantasy, where the companies it was plausible to say that they saw themselves as public actors and public leaders, and not merely as mouthpieces for that. And there's also plenty of examples of abuse during that time, but companies that took care of their employees had some kind of relationship with a unionized labor force that was a genuine ongoing relationship and not just an effort to destroy that labor force. Not like Spectrum and workers today, but like some kind of relationship. And this is where I think monopolization and financialization feed off each other to create something particularly toxic. This is why I want to talk about human nature when we talk about power. There's great evidence that I talk about in the book that when somebody gains too much power, it's almost like they've had part of their brain has been taken out. They actually become less empathetic, less able to care for people. And that right now, the more distant you are from your impacts, the harder it is. And that's true for anybody. If you see your investments going up and you don't see the nurses who are fired at the nursing home because they're not a local nursing home, it's just really hard for our brains to tap into compassion. And I think that we need that we shouldn't rely on that brief mid-century counter examples, especially at this point, because corporate culture has gotten so focused on financialization and sucking out the last penny. It's not that it couldn't exist for a minute, but I think it would be foolish to return to that. The question for me then, Tim, though, is not how do we destroy the existence of markets, but what are structures that we can have in place that make it more likely that the owner of the shoe company, hopefully not a monopolist, the owner of the nursing home, separate question about, I don't think they should be privatized, but the owner of these key companies has the capacity to call on compassion and to value things other than maximizing profits. So I do get at this in the last chapter, because I don't think anti-monopoly is sufficient. And we're at this real crucible moment. I think anti-monopoly is necessary, because we're not going to get to a moral economy when we have these gross concentrations of power combined with cultures of profit maximization and financialization. So we need to break through that. But on the other side, I think rethinking the nature of the corporation and using and like aiming for a moral economy instead of something that I think, unfortunately, both the left and right, even those with really different views, have tended to kind of think of markets as necessarily self-serving, selfish. You can't have market exchange and morality at the same time. It all has to be rule-based. There's no room for care. And I think it's not just wrong. I actually think it's naive. I think that moral structures and structures of compassion are necessary for a resilient society.
No, I'm glad to hear you say that. I am of that view myself, and I'll echo you a little bit, which is to say, even if you and I got everything we wanted in terms of antitrust enforcement, anti-monopoly, the fact is there will be big and powerful companies and or even small companies, and how they treat their employees matters a lot day to day in a way that it is almost impossible for an antitrust regulator or an enforcer, even with everything, to make people treat their employees or fellow workers or even competitors in a decent moral way. So I am greatly of the opinion that sometimes I think we almost overestimate the ability of the law. The law can punish, it can bully, it can tell people to do things, but it is a blunt instrument compared to the day-to-day of just like, how do you treat your workers? Do you give them any, and government can force them to do things like minimum wage, but just sort of that humane treatment is something hard to legislate. Maybe I put it that way.
I mean, again,
this is a question here.
Oh yeah.
No, you said it sounds like you wanted to.
Well, I guess I want to say that I have historically really worked on anti-corruption work, and the story there is the same. Is that we're going to have elected officials who are going to want power. So the question is not, can you ever destroy power seeking in the elected officials' realm, and can you get rid of any selfishness? And the question is, how do you design systems so that it makes it more likely that an elected official stays awake thinking about how to build a better bridge than how to gain the good favors of one of the wealthiest people in the world? And when we have campaign finance systems that just take over the brain of elected officials because it trains you to be a beggar, then that's bad. But that we have to root it in an understanding of flexible human nature that can be really cruel and human nature that can be really compassionate. And like, what systems make it possible? But that won't be sufficient. We still have to reintroduce some hope for caring for each other.
So I agree with that, and just to take that a little further, I think a lot of people who have corporate power in the United States, they didn't go into that job and hoping to starve their employees or have small producers commit suicide, but they are forced by a broader framework to ignore their moral instincts. And take things in directions. And this is a conversation about corporate governance, which in some ways is broader than the antitrust. Why have we designed a culture around it that it asks people to ignore their their instincts, ignore what they would think is humane, or maybe direct those forces towards a corporate social responsibility campaign where they, give some money to charity or something. But as opposed to the core of the business, I think that's as important as the.
Well, one of the things that
let me throw a question here. Sure. Okay, so here we are. There's a question about Congress, and direct question is Ms. Teachout. What would you see elected officials in Congress doing to strengthen the existing laws? And you give an example of a new law that can best address breaking corporate power.
Yeah. So I think the most important thing for Congress to do is legislate a structural approach towards anti-monopoly. And this is something that regulatory agencies did until the 1980s, basically brought a structural approach. Another way to think about a structural approach is a prophylactic approach, like a speed limit. Like, you may be speeding totally safe right now, but we aren't going to let you go above 65 because once we allow people to go over 65, more people die. So a structural approach in the anti-monopoly arena is to say, we just are going to be default opposed to, with possible it's overcome, to mergers in concentrated industries, even small ones. Even if it's 5% and 3% of a market, we're just going to have a default anti-merger presumption. And that we're similarly, another structural approach is if there's been a continuous monopoly really dominating the market, even if it's grown up organically over 5 years, you have a default presumption that you have to break it up. And both of those kinds of laws don't say, in this particular instance, you abused your power by charging suppliers too much to have access. Although I think we separately need to be much more aggressive in that kind of investigation. But they say, we just don't want to be in a situation of you being in a position where you can abuse your power. So I think when it comes to tech, for instance, people often have a organic mental model of what Google or Facebook or Apple is. Google bought a company a week in 2011. Right now, we are in the middle of one of the biggest acquisition sprees, the biggest since 2015, with big tech companies actively acquiring. And it's something I actually want to ask Tim about. This was a big topic at the hearing 2 weeks ago. One of the repeat topics were questions about acquisitions. I think Congress should step in where regulatory agencies used to and say a default no on acquisitions once you have a certain amount of market structure. But I have a very specific question, which is, Tim, you have been speaking about the Instagram Facebook merger, an example of a company acquiring what looked like a small company at the time. And you've been critical. What did you see in the hearing that was interesting about that acquisition?
It wasn't for me just the hearing; it was the document dump. So one of the things the subcommittee did, which was great, and actually I think shocked some of the companies, is they had subpoenaed. They'd used the subpoena power that's supposed to be used. Usually I don't know what they try and do with it, but they used it. They got all these documents, all the emails, all the texts, and I think they were shocking. They revealed that, and I think it was the worst for Facebook. Facebook has had a program in the last 12 years where they are watching potential competitors on the horizon, and there's no bones about it. The intent is to eliminate them as competitive threats. You were talking about Alexander the Great earlier. It's a little more like Genghis Khan. There's two choices: join us or face what actually not extermination, but you face a clone version. And it's very explicit in emails, and everybody kind of rumored about it, talked about it. The fact that the Federal Trade Commission and the relevant agency let those mergers go with those documents out there is shocking, because you don't usually get, just like as in criminal trials, you don't usually get the the accused saying, yes, I have a plan to do this. You rarely have that kind of documentary evidence. And at this point, if the FTC doesn't file, someone doesn't file, it will be a shock. Maybe they want to leave it for the next administration, but it is, the documents are shocking. If I could turn back to another, just on this topic of morality, if that's all right. I'm happy to talk about the hearing. But one of the things sometimes you hear that I'm curious what you'll say. Sometimes you'll say, capitalism is inherently kind of animalistic. It is somewhat brutal, and it has a survival of the fittest instinct. And if we try and sort of soften it, if you take away the ability to, if you tell companies they need to be a little more humane in how they treat their workers and their suppliers, well, then we'll lose that edge which has made America the richest country on earth. And you have to kind of run things. You in fact have to have people learn to disable their moral instincts in order to have the kind of greater wealth that we have, and then make all the money, and then we should distribute it later, or something along those lines. I'm curious. I'm guessing you don't agree with that line of instinct, but I'm curious what your reaction to the idea that it's sort of necessary.
Yeah, no, it's definitely not. In fact, right now, this triple strategy that we did see at the hearing, kill, acquire, or copy, basically, is totally deadening for entrepreneurs who then build companies basically at best to be acquired and to get rich from, not to see their magical work to its fruition. And I know a lot of people who have been entrepreneurs who go in, or small business owners who go in with full of the joy of creation. And one of the real problems of a monopolized economy is that basically you're a killjoy on the joy of creation, because your best case scenario is to get bought out. And the truth is, we don't know what incredible innovations are not happening right now, because people are not saying, I could go forth and really own my surfboard or parking lot finder service, or make up whatever you want and make it mine. So I was actually going to go talk about this earlier, but I'll talk about it now. Is I think about the analogy to me about how we understand markets right now and misunderstand them, is that if we thought about our human relationships with our partners, husband or wife, and he said, okay, well, sex is important. I have a long-term relationship, part to have sex, and it's great. Most people would agree with that. But it would be crazy if I then said, and therefore we should be sex maximizing. In fact, that would be an incredibly unsatisfying, at all other costs, basically. Like, forget conversation, get rid of that. But that's what we've done with the profit motive. Like, of course people want to make money, and that's okay. And it's okay to have a profit motive, but that doesn't mean you maximize it. Having a profit motive and treating your workers okay and bringing in new ideas, that actually brings in more of humanity. And the more humanity you bring into a market, the more creativity you bring to bear. So I think we're deadening the creativity with this like top-heavy system. But I avoid talking about. What'd you say, Tim?
I just said this has just become the most interesting antitrust conversation I've ever been in. Sorry, but you wanted to finish.
Oh, but I sort of avoid the talking about capitalism per se in the book, because I think capitalism means so many different things to people. Like, does it mean a bunch of people being able to invest, or does it mean the tail wagging the dog where Wall Street is making all decisions about our economy? Like, if it's the former, I think people should be able to pull together to invest. And I actually think on the left, where I come from, there's a little too much hand waving about capitalism as opposed to like the particular systems. So my first title for this book was Who Will Make the Shoes? Like, let's talk about it. Let's talk about what a moral market looks like, and not just sort of hand wave about terms that people bring really different meanings to.
Mm-hmm. Speaking of who will make things, I read somewhere here in New York, or I'm not in New York, but I live in New York normally. Some distressing number of Black-owned small businesses are going under in COVID right now, and it's just another, this concern for small producers, which has been lost, is really couldn't be reinvigorating in a more important time.
Yeah, I mean, people think of
let me get
mergers
to another audience.
Yeah.
Okay, well, if I can get to another audience question, that point I had about animal passions, maybe slightly different than your point, and this idea you have to sort of ignore your moral compass in order to have a wealthy country, often comes up in the context of China, and people saying, well, if we lose our edge, if we become one of these sort of touchy-feely places, well, then we'll be run over. And there's a question for both of us here, and I'll let you take it first, which is, how do you see the role of China and its economic power dynamics in upholding the toxic economic power structures in the United States?
Well, I think that we've seen that Zuckerberg is quick to run to basically use China as a defense for his own internal monopolistic behavior. But the root story he's telling there is we can't have a vibrant social media unless we have a monopoly, an unregulated monopoly. And I just think he's wrong on that basic fact. In fact, we're going to have a more vibrant one if we don't allow Facebook to kill Vine and other competitors. So that he has actually stood in the way himself, or the company, by using the acquire, kill strategy, has stood in the way of the vibrancy of our own system.
Yeah, let me take another. I'm going to say something slightly different about it, which relates to this question of producers. I think we need to think a little bit about China's practices over the last 12 years. And I feel like parts of the left have come around on this as almost like a predatory pricing regime.
Yes.
I don't think they have been. I think they have done enormous damage to the American producer, and I think I've changed on this. But I think this gets us into trade more than antitrust. But they are related, and if we're going to let a country, manipulate its own. I mean, in some ways they're more efficient. In some ways, China's not. China's just willing to devalue its currency or create its own barriers or have no labor protections in order to create products that are so much cheaper. And yeah, I think my thinking on that has changed a lot, and I think we need to do something. Otherwise, this basic idea that people will be able to be producers, make money, have a good life in the United States, it's not going to go that far. And there's this very I sound like I'm echoing a little bit our current administration, which is unusual in a California event. But I think there's more to it, and I think, in fact, I think the Democratic Party has been slow to awaken to this issue. And I don't know if you share those thoughts or if you have different ones.
No, I do. I think it's not wrong to connect trade and anti-monopoly, and to particularly talk about dumping and predatory pricing as subsets of a larger strategy that undermines our society and a vibrant economy.
Now, Zephyr, in our we have reached that point of our conversation where you are required to tell us what needs to change. So right. If you have, you've thrown a lot out there, but if you could, practically speak of priorities, if you were thinking what either a new administration, maybe it doesn't matter, but whatever, if Congress or the agencies or government or something could change, what would be the things to your mind that would be the priority?
Well, I actually think the most important thing is, prior to the technical solution, it's to make this part of our politics. And even people who think they know this will say, I know all about this, but then never talk to their Congress member about it, never talk to their senator about it. I know of one politician who calls himself an anti-monopolist in his Twitter bio. In California, you may be choosing a new senator. Demand that they come out strong on these issues and that they articulate these issues across the board when it comes to energy policy, tech policy, ag policy. So I actually think a lot of great solutions are out there, a lot of particular things that regulatory agencies can do. The missing piece is that people who think they care about this don't act like it's part of their politics. It's like money in politics in that way, where if you don't actually shake politicians up about it, they're getting a lot of money from big monopolists. So people can beat moneyed power, but you need a lot of agitation. There used to be antitrust leagues all around the country. I want to see thousands of antitrust leagues spring up and really, really force the issue in every industry.
Well, there does seem to be an appetite to it. And is there a cultural side, a way in which you think culture needs to change in addition to political change? Either the culture. I mean, you spoke already about the culture of corporations. The culture of government. I'm just curious if you have thoughts on that in our closing moments.
Well, I don't know entirely what you are what parts of culture you're talking about. I guess I'll answer a different question because we do have these closing moments. I think that one key thing that needs to change is there have been different anti-monopoly moments in different times in American history. There was a socialist anti-monopoly movement in the late 19th century. I'm speaking in very broad brushes, and more of a Brandeisian one in the early 20th century. But a lot of the people who were leaders in the early 20th century were also segregationists and terrible racists, and thinking about Wilson. And I think that it's really important, and I write about this throughout the book, that we really connect race and anti-monopoly and show the ways in which merging power is also bleaching power. And the destruction of Black-owned insurance companies, Black funeral homes, is not a race-neutral not a race-neutral destruction. That merger policy and racial and structural racism are deeply connected, and that's one of my goals in this book, is to do a more explicit job of connecting race and concentrated power.
Well, let me close this out. Zephyr, I want to say you have done a terrific job in this book, and I really want to recommend this book in putting, as you said, more of a human face, something people can relate to that is a lot more compelling than price theory. I mean, I like price theory as much as anyone else. Behind the face of economic power and the impact of economic power and its meaning and its potency. So let me give you thanks and remind you that the book is entitled Break 'em Up, Recovering Our Freedom from Big Ag, Big Tech. Was that the cover? Can you put that up again for us? Oh, good. And Big Money. And I would be remiss as a fellow author to say if I didn't encourage everyone to buy a copy through your local independent bookstore. If you do buy it from Amazon, I don't think Zephyr will. It's nicer, but I don't think it's important that you read it. And we want to finally close by expressing all our appreciation to all our viewers joining us online. The club has a wide range of virtual programs coming up, so please visit the website for more information. I'm Tim Wu, and this concludes today's program. Goodbye, everybody, and thanks.